Good morning again, everybody. It was really great I thought yesterday was a terrific day, very diversified, very stimulating, and I'm also glad to hear all of the energy, pick up all the energy in the room when I walked in this morning. What I wanted to do was I had jotted down some notes yesterday of comments that I was going to make. As a professor, I'm used to commenting on everything that everybody says, of course. And I think I exercised admirable restraint yesterday in allowing the audience to participate. And Jeff and Barry had to leave, but I see Victor is still in the back there. Good morning, Victor. Good morning, Victor. Yeah. I want to comment, make a few elaborations and comments on things that I heard. So the theme is I can't remember the theme. It's something about the global context and China adapting to the global context. And I think it's really important. We talked a lot about globalization. The whole idea of this being an interactive process is that when the leadership of China decided to open to the outside world, beginning at the very, very end of 1978, but not gathering steam really until the 1980s, it found a world system with which it was quite unfamiliar because it had retreated from that quite consciously over the course of most of the previous 30 years. So what we've seen is an interactive process of China adapting to the US-created world system. But at the same time, as China became increasingly integrated into the system, and Barry showed us the slides of China's enormous, unexpected economic growth, China had an impact on the shape of that world system. And then, was it Victor, who talked, Chris talked about, is Chris here? No. The Thucydides, that was the Thucydides trap, was Chris. So what we see is now, as a result of this interactive process, is a whole new set of rules being generated. The US is not used to being challenged, especially with the end of the Cold War 20-some years ago, being challenged of what we might call its hegemony over the world system. And the Chinese really, and this was stressed by several of the speakers yesterday, the Chinese really don't have a long-term strategy or view of what sort of a global system they would like to see. So it's improvisation on both sides. There is no real, there is no center to the global system as there was, say, at the end of the Cold War or the end of World War II. So what we see is this iterative, interactive process ongoing. I think Jeff, everybody made some terrific points yesterday, but I want to stress a few. Several people talked about nationalism. And when we talk about globalization, there's a very, very famous article by a scholar named Benjamin Barber called Jihad versus McWorld. And he talks about the conflict between globalization, which he calls McWorld, which is a sort of homogenization, convergence, and jihad, which is, of course, a very loaded term, to refer to a reaction against globalization. So that this is, again, one of the rise of nationalism in China and elsewhere in the world, including the United States, is a reaction against globalization and against McWorld. And this, again, is part of an interactive process. As globalization continues to take hold, you've got different kinds of responses to it. And one response at one extreme would be embracing everything from the outside, adapting it, adopting things, learning how to deal with it. Another extreme response would be trying to reject it, but using a lot of these new tools to have a deeper understanding of who we are and to reshape or shape or try to analyze one's particular identity. Jeff cited Marx and Marx's very prescient discussion of globalization. But one of the things that he failed, one of the things that I was surprised that Jeff did not mention is one of my favorite lines from the Communist Manifesto, when Marx talks about capitalism battering down all Chinese walls. that Marx predicted that capitalism, this was in the middle of the 19th century, was going to batter, that's his terminology, batter down all Chinese walls. What we see is not only has capitalism battered down all Chinese walls, but Chinese have then, in turn, battered down a lot of the walls of protectionism around the world as well. So this is another example of this interactive process. I would also stress one of the things that Jeff mentioned is that post-Tiananmen, the government, using bread and circuses, using consumerism as a way to distract people away from thinking too much about politics, is this whole idea of choice. And in one of the teacher sessions that I attended yesterday afternoon, Barry and I, we were asked about sort of what we saw as the most important changes in China with the reforms. And I think one of the greatest things is the removal of the Communist Party from its effort to control, micromanage all aspects of people's lives and letting people have more choice, an expansion of personal space, decisions, empowerment of the individual. It's not to the degree to which we're used to or that we would feel is satisfactory, but nonetheless, compared to what had been there in the past, the expansion of people's choices and ability to control their own lives is a very significant change since the reforms began. Jeff also made the important point that when you spend the period when you spend a lot of time in China shapes your perception of what China is, and then over time how China may or may not have changed. My point of view is living in China in 1979, right at the beginning of the reforms. So I tend to see the glass half full, or maybe even more than half full, because of this tremendous expansion of private space, individual autonomy, empowerment. Whereas people who went to China in 1988 or 1989, just on the eve of the Tiananmen demonstrations and crackdown, when they went in 1988 very excited, and then early 1989 about potential breakthrough into much more political freedom, and then the crackdown, their view of China is extremely negative as a rule, much different from the kind of view that I carry around in my head. I'm very critical, but nonetheless, I tend to take a longer view. And I think when you hear people talk about China, I think it's important to say, when did you start really experiencing China firsthand? Did you live there? When did you live there? What was going on at that time? I think that has a critical impact on how people think about China. One of the things that was not discussed enough yesterday, only alluded to, but I see it'll be David's theme this morning, is the role of the internet. And how China now, part of the whole idea of opening to the outside world, expansion of choice and so on, has been greatly impacted by the spread of the internet in China. And Chinese often refer to themselves, or the term that is used in English at least, is netizens, is that they really are increasingly integrated into the global cybersphere. Barry also stressed this contradiction between economic and political change and economic and political goals. Increased opening on the economic front, but at the same time now a response, surprising to many people, of an increased shrinking of space in terms of political activities. One other thing that I think is critical for us to appreciate is that China's not a monolith. We tend to say China this, China that. So many people who expound as experts on China don't really get out of Beijing, possibly Shanghai. And they're really unaware of the tremendous diversity of China. China's extraordinarily diverse, extraordinarily complicated, and Victor emphasized the hierarchy in the way this system, and I talked about policies from above and counter policies from below. China is not, it's not totalitarian. The idea, it's a dictatorship, but it's not totalitarian. And what goes on in Beijing often is very, very far removed from what goes on at the local level. The Chinese have an expression, heaven is high and the emperor is far away, meaning that heaven, they can make all these great sounding statements from Beijing, but in reality, what happens at the grassroots level may be very, very different. So I think we have to appreciate the diversity. I would also highlight the point that Chris Toomey made about crossing the river by feeling for the stones. the Chinese have not and do not have a long-term strategy. They've been improvising since they've been improvising since the communists took over, but especially since 1978 with the reforms. Crossing the river by feeling for the stones really is the way to characterize it. And they've been, which is out of character for a Leninist party, is to be willing to experiment, to trust, to tolerate a certain amount of spontaneity, and then let people try things, and then the leadership will decide what to confirm, what to say is okay, and what to say, no, we don't want to go that way. So there has been much more bottom-up kind of experimentation and proactive activity over the course of these reforms, which I think is something that we don't often appreciate. And finally, Paul referred to the speeches last night. I was mercifully in Shanghai during the Republican convention, so I had a plausible excuse not to be watching and only reading the headlines on my New York Times. I could have read them, could have read the speeches, but I said I'm not going to. But you know, we talk about our puzzlement about what's going on in China, and we often talk about trying to read the Chinese tea leaves. But I think we have to put ourselves in the shoes of the Chinese as they try to read the American coffee grounds. Can you imagine? I mean, what do the Chinese leadership in Beijing think when they hear Donald Trump talk? What do we think? You know, what can we make of the stuff that comes out of the stuff that comes out of? Okay, I'll confess, I'm not a big fan of Donald Trump. And it's not just because I teach at Berkeley, but well, let's not. We don't have to develop that line of thought. But so Chris was talking about putting ourselves in Beijing's shoes and trying to understand the American defense posture. It's not just the American defense posture; it's everything that's coming out of, in particular, the Republican campaign. Is how can they make any sense of that? So they might appreciate someone like Putin as someone appreciates Donald Trump as he's going to be a strong leader. Well, you know, I think they really don't. I mean, it's like most of us is also puzzling. What goes on in this man's head? Okay, I won't elaborate much more on that. But I mean, it still is. It's necessary to empathize, to put yourself in other people's shoes, not only in global politics, of course, but in daily life. Is where you stand depends on where you sit. And trying to understand how they might try to parse what's going on in our society. And there's a discussion about, somebody asked yesterday about the presidential campaign, or maybe I saw it on the news, about the presidential campaigns when China is often the focus of attacks by the candidates, but then after the elections, the leaders take a much more moderate stance towards China. So when the Chinese are asking, you know, what is going on in the United States? What is this Trump person, his attitudes towards China? The way that people respond, Americans respond generally, is don't really worry about it too much, because after somebody's elected, they will turn out to be moderate and continue to implement the same policies that we've been implementing all along. But nonetheless, the rhetoric, as it gets more and more heated, and when the presidential debates are going to be underway, China is probably going to be some sort of focus of that. But again, it's just try to imagine yourself sitting in Zhongnanhai, which is sort of the Kremlin of Beijing, the Forbidden City, and trying to make sense, figuring out what's going on.